Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Dan and Carol Burack Lecture. Tonight, this afternoon, our guest is the illustrious, sorry, Joe, I had to say that, Joe Sacco. My name is Andy Kolovis. I'm the Director of Archives and Research at the Vermont Folklife Center. We're a statewide cultural research organization that has offices in Middlebury. I know many of you were here yesterday, and I might say exactly the same thing I said yesterday, so I'm just going to do that. The Folklife Center has been involved with planning with our many partners at UVM, the event we're calling the Pulp Culture Comics Art Festival and Symposium here at UVM. This is the second of our keynote presentations. Last night, Art Spiegelman sat on the stage with Dan Fogel. And then we have another full day of events following this tomorrow at the Fleming Museum. I'd like to first just say a big thanks to all of our partners in this, including Margaret Tomulonis, who I'm looking right at, Jonah Steinberg, Glynis Falks, who is also here, Isaac Cates, who is on the stage, Jonah Steinberg, who's over there, and also Anthony Gruden from Art and Art History, who is a big help too. So anyway, welcome everybody today. And yeah, it's funny, I'm sort of flummoxed because I'm like, I can't say the same exact thing I said yesterday. But anyway, why comics and why folklife and why comics? I'm really interested in comics in part because I've always been interested in comics as a kid. And in my job as an ethnographer, I often think about different ways of representing human cultural experience. And in large part, the light was flipped for me through reading Joe Sacco's Palestine, where I started to make a connection between what I was doing professionally and the medium I love so much. So I'm really thrilled that Joe came up for this to do this for us today. So thank you very much, Joe. In any event, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here on behalf of the Folklife Center and our partners. And I'm going to welcome Dan Fogel up to the microphone.
Thank you, Andy, and I just want to thank you again and all the people who've been responsible for this event this afternoon, the President's Office and the Burack Lecture Series, everyone else. We're so grateful to you. There are times when a campus really feels like a university raised to a very high order of magnitude. So Isaac and I were saying to each other this morning, and in the midst of people last night like James Stern, Alison Bechtel, Joe Sacco, and Art Spiegelman, I think a lot of us really felt that we were transported to the heights of Parnassus. So thank you, thank you, thank you all. This afternoon features a conversation between perhaps the most amazing graphic investigative journalist of our time, Joe Sacco, and Isaac Cates, poet, cartoonist, scholar, and member of the UVM English department. Let me begin with Joe Sacco. Maltese American, Joe was born in Malta in 1960, raised in Melbourne, Australia, from ages 1 to 11, 12.
That's right.
He holds joint citizenship in Malta and the United States. He graduated from the University of Oregon in 1981. And his peripatetic career has taken him from one hot spot in the multiple crises of humanity to another. From Israel and the Palestinian territories to Sarajevo and Gorazde, and to Iraq, where he was embedded with United States Marines. The graphic reportage he has produced in the course of such travels has yielded multiple articles, co-mixes in the Spiegelmanian sense of the term of graphic representation and texts, journalistic reports in the same mixed media, and such major works as Palestine, Safe Area, Gorazde, the War in Eastern Bosnia, 1992-1995, The Fixer, A Story from Sarajevo, and many others. His stunning and deeply documented investigative reporting of massacres by Israeli troops in 2 Palestinian towns during the Suez War in 1956 went to the seemingly intractable reciprocal hatred that has charged the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for more than half a century. That reporting was fully embodied in ways unique to the medium of graphic narratives in his 2009 book, Footnotes in Gaza, which won the Reidenauer Book Prize given annually to those who persevere in acts of truth-telling that protect the public interest, promote social justice, or illuminate a more just vision of society. Among Mr. Sacco's other awards are the 1996 American Book Award for Palestine and the Gaza Strip, awarded jointly to Joe and Edward Said, the 2001 Eisner Award, and the same year a Guggenheim Fellowship. More recently, he has co-authored with Chris Hedges Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, 2012, an exploration of 4 centers of grinding poverty in the United States of America. In a review in the New York Times, Philip Mayer wrote, "Sacco's sections are uniformly brilliant. The tone is controlled, the narration neutral. We are allowed to draw our own conclusions. He allows characters and situations to speak for themselves. If you are a close reader, his point of view is clear, but it is controlled in such a way that you are allowed to disagree with him." The following year, Sacco published The Great War, July 1, 1914, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, an unpaged, panoramic, wordless narrative of the first day of one of the bloodiest battles of World War I that unfurls into an extended illustration 24 feet in length. In his review in the New York Times, historian Jeff Schiesal observed that in its visual vernacular, the book owes less to Sacco's previous style than to the accordion-pleated cityscapes of Matteo Pericoli, and even more to the Bayeux tapestry. And Schiesal notes that one of the many remarkable things about this book is Sacco's ability to portray scale without allowing us to forget that these are human beings. After all, every figure, however small or distant, is carefully rendered, almost perhaps as a mark of respect. Sacco's art of embodiment is the subject of a chapter in Hilary Schute's book, Disaster Drawn, titled History and the Visible in Joe Sacco. Joe, we are deeply honored and moved to have you with us here at UVM. Mr. Sacco's interlocutor is my colleague, Dr. Isaac Cates, who teaches courses in literature, writing, literary theory, and graphic novels here at UVM. Isaac is a poet, a literary critic and scholar, and the publisher, editor, and creative contributor to the family-friendly graphic narratives Cartosia Tales. Among his scholarly publications, I can't help citing what I think must be one of the coolest titles ever to appear in the venerable learned journal, American Literature, Isaac's 2011 essay on the literary use of superheroes, or Batman and Superman fistfight in heaven. He didn't want me to say much, but I can't tell you how grateful I am to have Isaac as a colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Sacco and Isaac Cates.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Andy and Jonah and everybody for organizing this. And my intention here is mostly to just try to have a conversation with Joe about his work. Although I'm planning to ask some questions that I mostly already know the answers to, because I've read other people interviewing Joe, and also we've talked before. But I kind of sorted my questions into 3 groups. So I'm going to try to ask a couple of things about comics journalism, and then a couple of things about journalism, and then a couple of things about comics. Okay. It's sort of an opposite of a Hegelian synthesis sort of thing, a deconstruction, I guess, of the idea. But I also have some images of Joe's work that I can cycle through, but because we didn't plan our Q&A, because we wanted it to be like a conversation, the slideshow is sort of unplanned too. There's some stuff toward the back of it that I don't think we're going to get to until toward the end of the conversation, but I may have to flip quickly past some things in order to get to other things and then flip back. You know, it'll work though. It'll be okay. And I'm going to work under the assumption that at least a handful of you folks in the audience may not have actually read all the way through one of his books, so that be a little familiar with the idea of what Joe's doing, and that many of you guys know already his work fairly intimately. So, you know, we'll try to start for the newbies. You know,
right.
We'll start for people who don't know what's going on, and then we'll kind of dip into more deep things. So, people certainly talk about you as being our major or primary comics journalist. I think it would be fair to say you're one of the first people to do it. How do you think of comics journalism as being different, possibly even better than other kinds of journalism? Like, are there things about comics journalism that are there things that comics journalism is better suited to do you think? Or maybe I should say that. Sorry. Better first question. How do you do it?
How do I do it?
Yeah, how do you do it? How do you go? Suppose we were gonna, suppose you're gonna put together a book like Footnotes in Gaza. What's your work process like? How do you make a book like that? We'll start there and then talk about the virtues.
All right. First, thanks for coming out, and thank you to all the people who brought me here, especially Jonah and Andy and just everyone. How do I do it? Well, the process has changed over time as I've begun to understand what I'm doing a bit better. I think when I first started out, I was relatively unsure of what I was doing. That was the book that became Palestine. I was experimenting with how to do it, and when people asked me what I was doing there, I didn't know what to tell them because I wasn't sure what I was doing there. I knew I wanted to do a series of comics about what was going on in the occupied territories. And I allowed myself to be carried sort of by the wind when I was there. I didn't really have contacts, so I would practice what I called a random form of journalism, which means I would get into one of the shared taxis that they have there and drive with everyone else in the taxi to some town in the West Bank where I would get out. They would stop in the square, the town square. I'd get out, and invariably someone would come up to me, usually within seconds, and say, "What are you doing here?" It was usually a young guy, and he would approach me in English, and I would say, "I'm here to see the occupation." And it was as random as that often. And so I would let that person decide what the occupation meant. And so he would say, "Oh, well, okay, let's go to the hospital. I'll show you what the occupation means. Or let's go visit this person. This has happened to him or her." And it was in that way that I got sort of an overall feeling for what was going in the occupied territories. And I think if you read that book, it has, I mean, part of it's, let's say charm. I'm going to use the word charm. Part of it is that it has episodes with certain redundancies, because often people would tell me the same kind of story. Mm-hmm. I wasn't mapping it out really specifically. I did learn, because I'd studied journalism, my journalism training sort of took over, and I did realize, well, I'm seeing these aspects of the occupation. I have to fill in other things. And then I began to look for those things specifically. But if you read the book, it's pretty episodic.
Yeah.
Later on, my style changed in a certain sense. I mean, when I went to Bosnia, again, I wasn't 100% sure what my story would be. I just assumed Sarajevo, multicultural place. I mean, pretty much the standard Western way of thinking about the war back in those days, if you remember it. When I got there, I quickly realized that people were really fed up in Sarajevo, foreigners coming to sort of, look under rocks for their stories. And I let the wind carry me to Gorazda, this town I had heard of, but it only became possible to go there while I was there. Right. Without huge, enormous risk and trouble. So I could get on a convoy and go, and I kind of fell in love with the place, and I just sort of let kind of my heart decide that's the story I want to tell, mainly because no one was I felt no one's going to tell the story of this town. And it had a lot of appeal to me. By the time you get to books like Footnotes in Gaza, I was very directed. That's a book where I knew beforehand what I was looking for.
Right.
And I did the research I could do beforehand. The interesting thing and the intriguing thing about that particular work for me was there wasn't much to really research because there was only one mention in a book by Noam Chomsky about a massacre or two that had taken place in the Gaza Strip in 1956. I was able to look up the UN document that he cited at the UN headquarters, or at the UN archives in New York, but there really wasn't much beyond that. Mm-hmm. So to me, the idea was, well, what can you construct from something that doesn't have what a historian considers really, you know, the meat and potatoes of history is the written word.
Right, with
ultimately.
no documentary evidence.
With very little documentary evidence. Since I've been able to uncover a little more here and there, but so the idea was like, what could I get from witnesses, eyewitnesses who were still alive? And what could I construct out of that? So that was much more directed. So over time, my technique has changed. I often go to a place, now I'm doing a story about indigenous people in the Northwest Territories, and I sort of come up with a basic idea of what I think I'm going to find. So in that case, or in this case, the book I'm working on now, I thought, well, it'll be about indigenous people and resource extraction. And so I sort of study that. When I get up there, I realize actually what's really, that is important, but what really is the shadow over people's lives is the residential school system, which ended only in the 1990s, and how culture was basically rubbed out by official educational means. And then you begin to realize, oh, this is really about colonialism and what it does and how it tries to break people from what they know. It basically tries to sever people from their cosmology. And so it becomes something else. And it's sort of a question of maybe having an idea of where it's going to go, but allowing yourself to go other places. And maybe this isn't answering your question, because maybe you're really asking the meat and potato stuff.
Well, I think it totally is answering my question, but it's also, I think, only like the first part of the answer, because so far, almost everything you've said, I could imagine a feature writer also saying about how they go to do some investigative digging after the dust has settled in an area, how somebody who's going to write, not like a newspaper story, but a longer piece of journalism, it goes and starts digging in and talking to people and getting their stories. But obviously doing it up as a comic it's gonna work differently. You know, you're not gonna be getting home and transcribing things to a typewriter and clattering away trying to generate so many thousand words a day in order to clear that deadline. Once you've got your research done, once you've come home from Palestine or wherever, what happens next?
All right, well, I mean, I've collected, I should say, I collect a lot of things or ask certain questions that a feature writer would not be asking. I think of myself as doing and asking questions that a feature writer would ask, but then asking what I call visual questions of someone. So in my book, let's say, I'll give you an example, Footnotes in Gaza, it's about, the main part of the book is about a town and a refugee camp called Rafah, and what happened there on a particular day. And a lot of it takes place in a schoolyard where Palestinian men were screened. The Israelis wanted to find out who was a guerrilla fighter, because there was a guerrilla war going on at the time. So I know I have to, you know, you can write a school, and that's one thing, but you've got to draw school, and school is a bigger concept when you're drawing it. It suddenly involves rooms. It's a particular school. I mean, in this case, fortunately, the school was built in the 30s and still exists. It's still used as a school. So I got permission to go in and take photographs of the school. I got one man to take me there and show me where people were sitting and that whole thing. I soon realized I needed to do that more thoroughly, so I drew a map of the school And every time I interviewed a man who'd been in the school on that day, I would ask them, well, show me where you were sitting. Where was the barbed wire? Where were the soldiers with the clubs? Where was the Jeep? You know, they would describe, it would give them something that they could use to help them tell the story and relate it to me.
Right.
So there's a lot more built into drawing than there is to just writing. I mean, when you're writing, you can say they were taken by truck to some camp. Like if you're doing a story about people in Bosnia being taken by truck, you think, well, what kind of truck? And at the very least, I try to be as informed as possible. If there are no photographs of that particular incident, I think, well, what are the trucks being used by Serb forces at that time? What are Yugoslav models that might have been used? So it's trying to get towards something. You might never actually get there, but that's the subjective nature of the beast. When I get home, it's basically I write. I transcribe all my own tapes because I feel like it helps. It helps me be back in that moment. Mm-hmm. It helps me listen to the inflection of people's voices, what really matters to them. It reminds me of those things which you forget after you've done 5 interviews a day for days. You forget what mattered to someone. You can hear it in their voices.
Yeah.
And I write. I spend actually weeks indexing all my notes. Because I have so many journal entries, so many pages of interviews that I need to know when a subject came up. So I spend a lot of time really thoroughly indexing it. It looks sort of like madness in a way, but it saves a lot of time later. Mm. And then I write. I generally write the entire script. And I don't thumbnail, I don't storyboard, and I just, at some point when I'm finished the script, I kind of just sit there with blank pages in front of me and say, oh, what should I draw today? Where's the script? And I just invent it at the moment to give myself some sort of spontaneous moment as an artist, because there's got to be some measure of enjoyment.
Right.
And I don't want to have made a lot of decisions about what I'm going to be drawing years ago.
Right, you know? Because you've come for Footnotes in Gaza, you get done with the research in 2003, right? And the
yes.
book is finished in 2009?
2009, right.
So it's 6 years of drawing that set of stories, right?
Right.
If you had planned it all out and thumbnailed the whole thing in the first year of those 6, then the next 5 would just be following your own instructions.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have liked that. I you know, as much as I tend to rely on decisions I made before, I think, okay, what was I thinking back in those days? For drawing, I really want it to be sort of fresh and have a spontaneous feel to it.
So you must have a lot also of like visual research also, like photographs and things that you took on the spot.
I take a lot of photographs. I'm not a sketcher. I mean, I've always admired cartoonists. You know, I'm always amazed at their sketchbooks, like Chris Ware's sketchbook, which he can print as a sketchbook. I mean,
full of little things saying, learn to draw, right? He's always berating himself for being a bad drawer.
Yeah, which is kind of insane. But I don't do that. I mean, really, everything I draw is for profit. That's how I look at it. And so every time I pick up a pen, it's like, how much money is coming out of this drawing? I mean, not exactly, but I mean, basically I don't have time for a lot of steps that to me are just going to bog me down. But I think every cartoonist is different.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's my way of doing it. I would never tell people that's how they should do it, because it might not be comfortable for them.
I almost imagine, I mean, this is just my impression of your work process, but I almost imagine that the journalist and cartoonist are sort of separate roles. That like when you are on site, you're mostly journalist.
Yes,
and when you get back and have written the script, you're mostly cartoonist. I mean, it's obviously, you're doing both at the same time either way, but...
But when you're in the field, you're thinking as a cartoonist. I mean, I think as a cartoonist all the time. I realize it might be very difficult for me to be a nonfiction writer. I might have to be forced into it if something happens to my hands or something, but I've always thought, am I going to be I might be a B writer, but I think of myself as maybe an A cartoonist because I sort of know how those things work, and that's how I think. I mean, you structure your thoughts and you structure a lot of your questions based on what you're going to be drawing later. You are thinking about that all the time. I mean, I'm mentally walking down a street somewhere, almost taking pictures with my eyes. I learn to see in a way that I don't really see when I'm walking the streets of Portland, Oregon. Things pass me by in Portland.
Right now I'm projecting the street scene from Safe Area Garage. Is that, I mean, that must be a composite of a bunch of different things that you saw sort of arranged into a scene, or?
Well, in some ways, but there was actually an area that had those particular apartment buildings that obviously had been built at around the same time together, where, yeah, maybe I've put a soccer game that I saw one day with people chopping wood, but those things were going on all the time as a mix. It is, I mean, it's a collage of things that were happening all the time in front of you when you were there. But those buildings, my hope is people from Garage would recognize those particular apartment blocks.
And like where we are in the town, based on,
To me, it's Garage, it's not any place.
I have there's just a couple of close-ups of the same image, actually, just so people can see the degree of detail in this image. So this is lower left corner, a little bit bigger. And then here's a sort of zoom in that's got a little bit of the background and a couple of guys wearing camo walking by a haystack.
The visual information is really important, because are you going to talk about haystacks? But I mean, you can draw that, you can show that it's part of, I mean, if someone had an animal that they were going to feed, they had to keep hay right by their house. Now that's probably not how it was before the war.
Right.
And people used to have heat, whether, I don't even know what it was before the war, electric or whatever, but they only had wood heat. So the cutting of wood was something you were hearing all the time. And you realize in a prose book about Garage, they might mention wood.
But it wouldn't be present on the edge of the image all the time.
Yeah.
Like every time you're outside, somebody's doing it.
Exactly. So, you know, to me, the important thing is to show that stuff going on in the background very often so that the reader really feels that. You know, it's something that's always there. The sound of it was always there.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you can't page through any of the sort of present moments in this book, or well, in this book, without seeing damage on the buildings. Like almost all the buildings have places where they've been hit by a shell or by some kind of an explosive.
Right.
And so you're constantly reminded in the environment of the history that you're not present for, but that you're there to interview people for. And,
well,
and
that's a good way of putting it.
Visible as scars on the buildings all around you all the time while you're there in the present. And again, that would be, like, you would mention it if you were writing a prose feature, but it wouldn't be a constant presence in the same way.
Well, I like your construction. I mean, to say it's a reminder. I mean, comics can be used as sort of a reminder to the reader of where they are at all times. You know, rather than now we're talking about this and now we're talking about that. You're actually in an atmosphere when you're, I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of comics, as far as you were asking earlier.
Right.
What are the advantages? And I think that's one of the advantages of comics, is that you build an atmosphere with images, and you build sort of a constant feeling with images.
How do you think about comics journalism relative to documentary film? Like, are there advantages that you've got over a documentary filmmaker?
Yeah, but I'd say, I mean, documentary film has its own advantages. I'm not one to say that I happen to be a cartoonist, so obviously I'm trying to go to the advantages of what I do, but documentary film often has difficulty going into the past, because sometimes it has to go deep into the past, and it has difficulty going into places where there are no cameras. I mean, you can have people talking about being tortured, but when you've talked to someone who's gone through interrogations, you can actually bring the reader to places that are where people don't normally go, if it's been well described to you.
Right. And
so those are some advantages. And I think what documentary film tries to do more frequently is have, what do you call it? Sort of, they reenact certain things. And I've always found these things really jerky. You know, have you seen those like great documentaries about like the Crusades or something, and then they only have money for about 5 guys and a horse, you know, in the distance. I mean, you know, if you have the patience, you can draw 500 guys and a horse, you know, if you're a cartoonist.
Horses, though,
I mean,
never.
I think, do you know what I mean? It's like, and someone else brought this up to me a while ago. Even photographs of the past, they look like they're the past.
Right.
I can't remember who brought this up, but I think it's a really interesting point. Whereas drawings of the past look like drawings of the present if it's the same hand. And to me, I'm really interested in the organic nature of history and how things relate and how things really lock together. So there's less of a separation because of the very nature of the medium.
Right. You can cast the actual person in the reenactment.
Yeah.
And the reader can see.
The reader's going along for the ride and knows that this is a subjective experience, but just keeps going along for the ride. There doesn't have to be, and there shouldn't be probably, a real hard cut if you don't
Right.
want it, if you don't want one to be there.
Yeah, in Footnotes in Gaza, it's actually a little tricky because the people you're interviewing are 50 years older than they are in the flashbacks.
Right.
So they get younger
They
when
get
you go
younger,
into the flashbacks, and you have to take a second to, the reader has to take a second to recognize the younger person. But there's always a distinctive nose or something like that
Yeah.
that helps you figure out, the very skinny guy is the guy I'm supposed to be watching. And then, and then he becomes the same person you were listening to, but younger.
Right. I mean, there's a pretense to it, but it's one that I think, because drawing is just by its nature subjective, I think the reader goes along with.
Right, because none of it's photographic.
No.
Right, the present is no less subjective than the flashback. I'm projecting some images from Palestine of a guy talking about being tortured. But it occurs to me, I think farther in the slideshow, I have some images of Eden from Sefer Garajda. Where is he? Here. So this is the guy who in Garajda was sort of like your guide or your fixer or whatever, and this is him in the present. And here he is in a flashback, and the eagle-eyed readers will notice that Ed in the present has a scar on his eyebrow that's not in the flashback. He's not much younger, but we also in the book see him receive that scar. He's hit with, I guess, shrapnel.
Sniper.
Bullet. Oh, a bullet.
Mm-hmm.
He's very lucky to survive
very lucky,
that. Yeah. So yeah, there you go. You get an explanation for that scar. I wanted to ask you also about, I guess, balancing the large-scale story and the small-scale story, because almost all of the work that you're doing in the field is individual interviews of really people's subjective memories, but you're also trying in each of the books to put together a story about large-scale conflict as it happens in a moment, articulated maybe in a single massacre or a single siege, but you've got to also provide context and things like that. And I wonder if you feel like striking that balance is a slightly different game for somebody working in comics than it would be for somebody working in prose.
I don't know. I think it's possible to do even in prose. I don't really see that so much as an issue. To me, I'm very interested in the bigger picture, and I'm interested in the bigger picture because within the bigger picture are all those people who make up the bigger picture, and the people who are kind of run over by history, the people who just happen to be there when something is going on. I mean, I've felt this from just hearing my parents' stories about the war, World War II, and you realize, I mean, they had nothing to do with with cranking up the war, but they are in a certain place that's going to get bombed, and the same is true for a lot of the people I've met, where they are caught up in events. And to me, the individual story is what I think is just natural. It's what makes us relate to that, because we can sort of, hopefully we can see ourselves in the place of those people.
Oh, sure. I think I may actually be thinking about the question sort of from the other end, as if, I mean, it's easy for me to see how to tell the small scale stories in comics, because you can put the actual person there on the page and have their speech coming from their mouth, and then do a flashback that's oriented around their own experience. But you don't want to only have a series of anecdotes.
No.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you build the big picture stuff that is harder to visualize because it's happening on a larger than personal scale?
Right. Well, I mean, it really depends on each particular story. You have these images up from the book I did on Garajda, and it was possible finding Eden. I realized just talking to him, like a lot of people in town, you could tell the story of what the town experienced from 1992 to 1995 through his story, because he was at the very beginning of the story of the town during the war. Most of the Serb population left suddenly overnight, including his neighbor. Then, within a few days, they attacked, and so pushing Eden and his family out of their particular neighborhood. When Eden's side, the Bosnian army side, pushed the Serbs back out, he returned to his home, and it was clear to him that his Serb neighbors had taken his skis. These were people he was friends with. They'd taken his skis because he found them in his Serb neighbor's home. So you can tell, through him, I was able to tell these vignettes add up to the story of the town in a way. He was a soldier during the war. He was a teacher during the war. He was working with, when UN forces came to be peacekeepers and the British were there, he was an interpreter. So sometimes you can find an individual who manages to be there at all those significant mileposts to create the bigger story. And sometimes that's fortunate, and sometimes you're looking for something like that. He just sort of fell into my lap.
You were almost talking about this earlier, but because you started off talking about going around in Palestine and beginning to do the journalism that became the book Palestine. But I wanted to ask also how you made your way into comics journalism. Like what's the origin story there? How do you think about what I mean? I guess you'd think of Palestine as being the first foray into it, but what motivated that, or what? I mean, you guys may not know, the audience may not know that Joe was also doing sort of satire and autobiographical stuff before doing comics journalism, and I wonder, like, what pushed you to do this slightly different thing?
Well, I mean, we always have to acknowledge there were antecedents for what I've done. Like back in the 1800s, cartoonists, or illustrators, I should say, illustrators were going with armies. I mean, Harper's Magazine, the Illustrated London News. I mean, before photography, there were illustrators.
Yeah, I don't mean how did you invent it. I mean, how did you personally wind up doing it?
Well, I mean, it came out of a real dissatisfaction with journalism, because that's what I studied in school. And it came with a real dissatisfaction of the American style of journalism, and particularly over the issue of the Palestinians. Because, I mean, I've told the story before, and maybe some of you heard it in some other venues or whatever, but basically I grew up thinking that Palestinians were terrorists. And when I was able to finally break that down after I got out of journalism school, I realized what it was that every time I heard the word Palestinian, it was in terms of a hostage situation, a attack on a bus, a Katyusha rockets being fired into Israel. The only time, I mean, no, and all these were objective facts, but the only time I ever heard the word Palestinian was married to those objective facts. So I realized, I created a picture in my mind that Palestinians were terrorists, and that began to change in the early 80s when Israel first, when they attacked Lebanon in 81, and then during the massacre of Palestinians at Sabra and Shatila in Beirut, carried out by Christian allies of the Israelis. That's when something began to dawn on me that there was something going on that I didn't really understand. And I actually thought of myself as a relatively smart guy. I mean, I was really politicized by what was going on in Central America at the time. I thought I was really suspicious of what was going on. And then you realize, oh, wow, I've taken on some way of thinking about the world that there's probably something else going on here. Why were these Palestinians getting massacred? I thought they were the terrorists. So I just began to educate myself. That's basically how that all played out. That had to do with reading. It had to do with living in Europe for a while, where people have a much more, let's use the word balanced approach to what's going on there. And then it came to the point where I thought, I'm going to go and just see what's happening. At that point, I was making a living making like rock posters in Berlin, and I thought, well, it's not such a long flight to Cairo, and I can take a bus. In those days, you could take a bus from Cairo to Jerusalem. What's stopping me? And once that got into my head, I thought, now I have to do it, because I don't want to live with the coward I know I am, so I'm just going to go and do that. And I didn't really understand what I was going to do, but having come out of at the time I was doing autobiographical comics, I just thought, well, I will do autobiographical, sort of a travel log about my experiences. I'll go to the West Bank and maybe to Gaza and see what I can find out.
There's an element of that also in Palestine. I mean, you are a character in the book, that we follow you.
Right.
But you're also getting other people's stories and telling them with some fidelity to their account. So it sort of slides in and out of your own subjectivity or whatever.
Right. And I think that's the thing about it, is because I didn't really know I was not thinking, oh, I'm going to marry comics and journalism. I guess the point of this is to say that I had no theory laid out.
Right.
This was all a very organic process of just going there. I'm going to do a series of comics, so I'm not just a voyeur in this place, about my experiences. But when I was there on the ground, all that journalism that I'd been studying just kicked in. And I began sort of, let's say, behaving as a journalist, thinking as a journalist, and seeing what I could find out, like trying to piece together something as a journalistic story rather than just, here I am, blah, blah, blah. The theory sort of came later, and I began to know what I was doing more with the Bosnia work. But that's kind of the genesis. The genesis was really just go and find out about this issue you're interested in. I probably would have gone if I was a photographer. I probably would have gone if I was a filmmaker.
I think I think a lot of people have the assumption that journalists work to be as impartial as possible, right? To tell a story and sort of represent both sides. And this is not something that I don't get a strong. I don't feel like that is an urgent thing for your books, because often you're really sort of getting to know people on one side, usually the side whose story hasn't been told adequately in other places. I can imagine people seeing your work as really partisan or even objecting to it for that reason. I wonder if you would, I wonder what you think about that sort of imperative to tell both sides of a story when you're setting something up where if you can see that one side is a victim, how much do you feel like you have to be fair and balanced, or whatever what is the Fox News tag?
I don't know what the Fox News tag is. Thank God.
There's actually there's a panel of Palestine where you mention it briefly, right?
Well, it depends on what
both sides of the issue.
It depends on what it depends on what the story is. Now, 25 years ago, I guess it's that long ago, that I was sort of I was over there thinking about this book, I would say that the dominant story was the story that really favored Israel, and where I grew up thinking Palestinians were terrorists. To me, it didn't seem absolutely incumbent to retell the Israeli position in a sea of media that was telling the Israeli position. To me, what interested me was, who are the Palestinians? Mm-hmm. Now, so you can say I'm not being objective, and I'm actually okay with that. But what I try to be is honest, because like I want to tell their situation honestly, and being oppressed is no guarantee of finding angels among the oppressed. So I want to sort of talk about what oppression does to people. It doesn't ennoble.
Right.
It usually doesn't. So I can have sympathies for people, but try to say, okay, let's see what's going on here. You meet people who are really, they will think, no, we have to do this, but yes, we have to respect the Israelis. And then you meet people who aren't like that. So to me, what's incumbent upon me is to show the Palestinian experience as honestly as I can. That is not the same as maybe being objective, but I'm okay with that.
Well, it's a kind of objectivity. I mean,
well, yeah. In some ways it is. I call it honesty because objectivity means, to me, having studied journalism, you just hear American journalism, they have this kind of really flaccid way of thinking about things. It's like, well, there's this side and there's that side, and the truth resides somewhere in the middle. And I think that's just hogwash. The truth often doesn't reside somewhere in the middle. And I think it's up to the journalist to sort of see, well, let's try to see where we can we get close to this truth?
Yeah.
But I think it's important to sort of admit your perspective, so the reader who objects to you can say, well, that's just a prejudiced, that's a very prejudicial way of looking at this topic, and that's okay. They should be able to do that. But what I don't want is someone pretending to be objective, and then they're just going to give you the same old hogwash I learned.
Right. So, yes. I wonder, there's something you said a little while ago about going to Palestine in part because you didn't want to live with your own cowardice about like having had the idea but then not doing it.
Right.
And it occurred to me, certainly in reading Footnotes in Gaza and in some of these other pieces, you're going into fairly dangerous places. Are you, like, have there been times when you've been genuinely afraid for your life in the process of doing the research, or have things more or less calmed down by the time you get there?
Well, I'd say mostly it's always been worse before and after, I've found. I mean, that's just luck of the draw. There have been a couple of times where it's felt pretty dangerous, but generally I situate myself with a guide, someone who really knows the terrain well, usually not a professional fixer, because I find there's real problems with professional fixers, but someone from a community who understands it and understands how to behave in that community, and understands how to behave when certain things are happening around you. And I let that person sort of be my guide. So I try to be as safe as possible. I mean, because it's funny, because both photojournalists and cartoonists work with images, but boy, photojournalists are up front. When they're shooting, I'm kind of thinking, okay, what's behind me and which way am I going to go? And photojournalists are just walking toward that stuff. And I'm not that. I'm not a photojournalist.
You talking about professional fixers makes me think about your book, The Fixer, and about this character Nevin, who is, I mean, he is a professional fixer at the time when you meet him, right? And he's where is this slide? Yeah, here we go. He sort of insists on arranging stuff for you in Sarajevo, and when you first meet him in the book, he's really menacing, and there's things about him that remain sort of ambiguous and frightening all the way through, really, until kind of I guess there's a moment at the end that's kind of a coda where he's grown kind of dissolute and he doesn't seem as menacing anymore. But there's times when he, I mean, I don't know, I find that book, I find the ambiguity of that book really interesting in the context of your other stuff, because there are questions about Nevin that are really never resolved.
That's right.
And I wonder that, I mean, I guess I can see the answer to this question because you wrote the book, but I wonder whether like it felt weird to be writing a book where you didn't know the answer to some of the questions when all of your other, when your stuff in the same area was all worked out before you started to draw the book.
Well, I think a lot of journalists don't know the answer to certain questions, and they try to behave very authoritatively as if they do. I'm really interested in sometimes showing, like with this book, I was interested in showing some of the seams of journalism, like those places where you really have to question the whole journalistic project when you need people between you and the story. And that's when you often don't speak the language, or you're in a place where only someone who really knows the situation is going to be able to guide you, because they have their own politics, they have their own agenda, and that's the story there. Nevin was interesting to me, not just because he's probably one of the most interesting people I've ever met, but because, yes, he was menacing, because through him, I could tell another story of Sarajevo. You were asking, like, how do you tell the big picture, the small picture? Well, there's Nevin. At the beginning of the war, Sarajevo didn't really have a force to defend itself with. Milosevic gave over pretty much the armory of the Yugoslav army to the Bosnian Serb forces besieging Sarajevo, so pretty much the people who were having to defend the town were either police or criminals, like whoever knew how to use a gun. And Nevin was in one of these many gangs that popped up. You could just basically say these people who started these gangs ended up becoming warlords. They had their territories, they could extort money, they could give out favors, they were really in control. And at some point, Nevin was in one of these gangs in a very interesting situation where he was actually a Bosnian Serb who actually believed the whole concept of the multicultural way of thinking of Sarajevo. He loved Sarajevo for that reason. But he was in a gang that was almost all Muslims. So in some ways he felt slightly excluded, but in other ways he really believed in the project. And at some point, the Bosnian army was reconstituted, and those gangs that had been given military designations were crushed by that part of the army that was loyal to the government and not loyal to the warlord. So through him I could tell those stories, but I could also tell the story of how much you need, a journalist is often dependent on people to get to the truth.
Who may be filtering the truth.
Who might be filtering
the
truth, not just about the situation on the ground, but about themselves.
Yeah.
And so I just find that interesting, and it's not, to me, it's not about resolving the question. You don't want the hard answers at the end. I mean, to me, it's about letting the reader in on that problem and that dilemma.
I think you can see the panel that I'm projecting, right? I think this might be a good time to transition also to asking you some cartooning questions, because I can see the amount of labor in this panel. It's about a half a page of it's about a half of the page, and not a lot of drawing in the panel, but an awful lot of ink and a lot of small lines. You guys can see that with the resolution of the projector, yeah? I mean, one of the things about Joe's work that has always struck me, I would even say maybe flummoxed me, is the amazing amount of texture and cross-hatching that goes into each of these drawings. How long would it take you to do a thing like that, man?
Minutes.
Just minutes?
No.
You could all do a couple of clicks of the computer, right?
I mean, it probably took more time. But you know, to me, when you look at that picture, you'd say, okay, it probably didn't take that so long to pencil that picture.
Right.
But
that's what I meant when I said not much drawing.
But you had to. There was a lot of ink that had to go down. But I have this thing of once you start it, you just got to do it right. And it was the Holiday Inn. It had a generator, so they actually had some electric lights, but it was really gloomy inside. And if you're, I really want the reader just to feel that.
Yeah. No,
so
it's a menacing panel. I think it's wonderful, but I also, I marvel at the amount of work that it took to pull that off. It must be days of drawing for this.
It was
panel.
Probably more. Yeah, it was
like a couple of days.
It might have taken even more than that. But the thing about hatching is you sort of get into a zone where you can. It's not as hard as it looks, because you're kind of meditating. When you're doing the lines, let's say the outline of sort of the reception desk or those chairs, which really took a long time to get right, or my figure, that's real concentration. That's actually sort of slow work. The hatching takes time, but the work itself is kind of fast, if you know what I mean. And your brain is not working in the same, you're not burning as many calories when you're hatching. Let's just say that.
Can I ask, I think I know what you'll say, but couldn't you now, if you were going to do, on your next book, couldn't you now do the grays with just filling in some gray tone with the computer or something like that? Couldn't you do this in an easier way? Or maybe the real question is, I know you don't want to do it in the easy way, so what is it about working in this way that you prefer, that you value?
The pure tactile experience.
So it's your pleasure in the drawing more than
I have
what
to
you
have
think
pleasure in the
gets.
drawing, or else I wouldn't do it. And I got to say, this seems strange. I don't even know how to use Photoshop, and I say that not out of any sort of
pride.
No, I don't say it in pride, because I actually want to learn how to use Photoshop, because I think that would save a lot of trouble on the production end of things. But I like having a page. It's not that I'm thinking about this has to go in a gallery. It's not like that, but it's like there's just a real pleasure in it. There's a pleasure in ink and a pen and the scratching of it.
Yeah.
I love that feeling, and I wouldn't want that to sort of go away. So I would rather do the work and kind of have the satisfaction, basically.
Yeah, I think there may be also a payoff in the way the reader receives a panel like that too. When it's something that's really heavily hatched like that, it insists that you worked while you were making the image, and that means that the reader is supposed to sort of value it also, or to pay attention to it also. I remember once I was talking to Anders Nilsson about drawing, and a lot of his books are very slow. There are these really slow moments, and I said, how do you get the reader to slow down? And he said, oh, you just draw more slowly.
That's a great answer.
Which is, it seemed like a flip answer, and then I realized that he was quite serious about it, that he moved the pen more slowly when he wanted the reader to slow down, because it made a more deliberate looking page. And the amount of sort of effort or the amount of the sort of labor of the cartoonist's hand that's visible in the page arrests you a little bit and says, in this panel, there's not a ton of stuff to look at, although we also get a really severe sense of the gloom of the building. I actually also put a couple of panels in from the next, or the following sequence where you're sort of getting over jet lag in the hotel, I think. And it's right after this, he comes downstairs to the lobby and Nevin is sitting in the same spot and says something like, I want to buy you coffee.
Right, that was the last time he bought me anything.
But again, this is a pair of silent panels that if you could skip over them essentially without reading them, because you can tell what's going on in them with just a glance. But because of the labor in the drawing, I don't mean that the drawing is belabored. I mean, you can see that there's work there. It makes them happen more slowly, which makes the time and the sort of weariness.
Well, I mean,
palpable.
if you look at, you often don't look at other cartoonists for inspiration. Sometimes you look at fine artists for inspiration. I think of Rembrandt's pen and ink sketches, and seeing those in person. And there's something about that that really just clicks for me. I do like things that have labor in them.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the way you have to do them, and I think there's absolutely valid work that is really quick. In fact, I admire it and I envy it.
Right.
But I'm just not that person, that's all.
Yeah.
And so you just go with the person you are, and that's who I am. Is
Yeah,
like
my kid-
I like to labor over things.
My kid wanted me to copy a Quentin Blake drawing for him the other day, and I was like, I can't. That's too much like his handwriting. There's no copying that. You know, it's super spontaneous. You can tell every one of the drawings in a Quentin Blake illustrated book took 3 minutes to draw, tops, but it's perfect.
And it's effective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you unless you drew it in 3 minutes, you wouldn't be able to copy it. And since I don't know where my hand, I can't make my hand do what his hand did. I can't
Right.
copy it.
Right.
I wanted to ask you also about. I also wanted to ask you about your self-caricature. People have been, you guys have been able to see Joe long enough to have a sense of what he looks like, and this is what he looks like in the comics. Here he is again. And I wonder, I wonder why you draw yourself this way. I mean, you make yourself a little bit grotesque, you know, or a little bit certainly over exaggerated, but in a way that's like, yeah, goofy looking.
Yeah, but if you look at even if you look at the early pages of Palestine, everyone looked that way.
That's true.
And so it just so happened that there were objections to the way I was drawing by both Jews and Arabs, Semitic people. Like, everyone has big noses. And to me, everyone does have big noses when they become cartoon characters, unless they have really tiny noses. So I just never really thought about it. But then you realize, okay, if this is going to be journalistic, I can see why I have to maybe start thinking more representationally. And to me, it's really forced. I've never...
To make people look more realistic or representational?
Yeah,
feels forced?
It's not... I'm not a natural... I don't find it's a natural way for me to draw, but it's an appropriate way for me to draw, if you know what I mean. As I tried to be more representational, a couple of years down that road, someone said, how come you keep drawing yourself that same old way? And I hadn't even thought about it, because the thing is, you draw yourself so often that you don't even, it's just shorthand for you, and you just use the shorthand for you, and you're not like thinking, oh, now I need to get, you know, as handsome as I actually am. I need to sort of make myself more handsome or something. But I will say there's a truth to the way I draw myself, in that drawing can get to the essence of really something else, and I can feel just as goofy. That's the inside of me coming out into my face. If you know, that's the inside. It's true. It's true in a certain sense. It's true.
No, I like that, because I think one of the things that people would not probably glean about your books from the conversation we've had so far is how funny they can also be. That there are moments, even in these really sort of tragic places, there are moments and there are characters that you feel a sort of happy enthusiasm for. I have a slide earlier on of Ricky from Sefer Garajda belting out some Simon and Garfunkel. And like, he's such a charming character and so funny every time he's on, I was gonna say on screen, in the panel. You know, he's wonderful. And without him, the book would seem so much darker. You know, that, I guess what I'm saying is, I know there's this thread of comedy through your work, or not comedy exactly, but something lighter that stays there even when you're doing the journalism.
Well, to me, it's just standing out of the way of the people who are there in front of you. And Ricky is a real character. That's how he behaved, singing all kinds of tunes at really inopportune times. And
high volume from
yeah, very high volume. And I don't know, why wouldn't you put him in it. I mean, he was absolutely charming, and he was a soldier. So I mean, it was really interesting. But and there's a lot of black humor in those places, and really you have to stay out of the way of the black humor, and let the black humor sort of be itself. And you have to stay out. You know, it's funny how journalists, when they often talk about certain things, they would get so fed up when, not fed up, I shouldn't say that, but they found it really not of interest when younger people in Bosnia who were under siege would start asking them about, look, so what's the music now? What's going on? They wanted to know about music. They wanted to know about culture. And to me, boy, that was what was interesting.
Yeah, there's a moment in Seyferic Garajda where you're like telling somebody about some basketball player being traded.
Oh, Clyde Drexler, because he was a fan of the Portland Trailblazers in Garajda, you know. So, and I happen to be from Portland, so yeah, I can talk about Clyde Drexler. And you know, do you remember when Michael Jordan dropped out of basketball, then he came back, and they were asking me about Michael Jordan, and I said, you know, did you know he was back? And they were like, he's playing again? I mean, they didn't know stuff like that. And to them, to me, what's interesting is what people hang on to under those circumstances. I mean,
Right.
if you're not worried about a shell landing on your head or what you're going to eat, the next worry is like, how am I going to be a human being again?
Yeah, what do we do for fun?
Yeah, and what is culture now? And those were some sophisticated people I was meeting, and it really mattered to them.
Thinking about comedy reminds me that I also wanted to get you talking some about Bumf.
All right, good. I'm happy to talk about Bumf.
Bumf is actually Joe's most recent book, I think. Is that right?
Who's heard of Bumf? You know, my royalties were for 6 months on Bumf, and I didn't take an advance, so I got every cent of every book sold. I mean, I got a percentage. In 6 months, my royalties for North America were $17.
So
the first 6 months, people bought the book because I did a book and they bought it, but the second 6 months, man, that book.
So in case you haven't seen it, Bumf Volume 1 is a really obscene political satire. I think obscene is fair.
Yeah,
it's
it's
deliberately obscene. It's really a satire about the excesses of the Obama administration, in particular the record of torture in the Obama administration, I think, and also surveillance.
Surveillance, drones. I mean, there were many things about the Obama administration. I mean, there were many things about Obama I had hoped he was going to roll back some of that executive power.
Yeah.
And now we see like someone who, you know, people will say, well, under Obama, people say, well, I trust Obama. Well, I mean, if executive power is executive power, and Trump can build on that executive power too, so.
Yeah. And am I right in reading it as, I mean, I should have asked you about this before I started talking about it. It's as if Nixon is reincarnated into Obama's body, sort of overnight.
To me, it's Nixon is now finds himself
in the
sleeping
role
next to Michelle Obama,
Yeah.
and he is Nixon, but everyone else, no one knows it's Nixon. It's to them, it's all Obama.
It's just the president.
Yeah, just the president.
Although the human poultry object knows that.
The human poultry item.
Sorry. The human poultry item, he looks a little bit like a mashup of a chicken and Bert from Sesame Street, something like that. He recognizes that the president is new and needs to be shown around, right? So
he recognizes Nixon.
Yeah.
And he knows it's Nixon, and.
But he's maybe not. Yeah, he's a sort of odd. Well, the whole thing. None of it is very realistic. It's surreal. The human poultry item eventually takes him to a parallel or a distant planet, maybe a parallel universe where some of the most extreme extradition is taking place, and shows him around, shows him the ropes. Later, they give him a joystick and let him run a drone for a while and blow some people up. I wonder about Bumf. I mean, what got you there? Like what? I want to ask. I mean, I've heard you talk about this already this weekend, but I want to ask, like, what? I mean, we know you as a comics journalist, and not primarily as a satirist, although I know you've done it, and you've done it before and continue to do it, but I wonder, like, what was the impetus for this project?
Well, it wasn't my pension fund. Like almost anything I do is sort of an anger, frankly. You can do things with journalism, but there are things you can't really do with journalism. And you know, with fiction, you can do things. You can add in all those spaces between those like markers that journalism can set up. Journalists often sort of know in their heart, or they can sort of speculate why things happened the way they did, but they don't have evidence of it. And fiction writers can get you from point A to point B,
right,
with fiction. So this is to me is like science fiction, surrealism. It's a way of talking about a lot of things that it's not really appropriate in a journalistic context.
Yeah.
To really, I want to speculate about certain things. I mean, an example is how citizens become non-citizens. That's the British government will take away the citizenship of someone so they can be killed by a drone, because then you're not killing your own citizen. Under Obama, they killed American citizens in Yemen. And you can make an argument for killing those particular individuals for certain reasons, but something was lost in that we're now killing someone without we're assassinating. He's not being killed in combat.
And he's not being killed as the result of some judicial process.
Right. So something is happening, and that's those sorts of things are really troubling to me, and those are some of the things I wanted to bring up. I mean, there's a part where people in the comic where you're no longer designating, I get into that. You're people being designated as something other than people. And I'm interested in certain philosophical concepts like the state of exception. You know, airports are now a state of exception where anything can sort of happen to you, and law doesn't really, as we know it, doesn't really pertain.
Yeah, it doesn't protect you anyway.
So the idea here is the state of exception keeps moving outward from those points of exception. So eventually it encompasses everything we know. Everything is in the state of exception.
Right.
Law doesn't pertain at all.
They literally cede territory in the United States to the distant planet.
Yeah,
so that they can continue to do illegal things, or
it's
things
like
that would be
Guantanamo.
illegal in the U.S.
It's
right.
like Guantanamo. It's like what Australia does I can't remember the name of the island, unfortunately, but an island where Australia controls the island, but Australian law doesn't pertain there. Okay, thank you very much. So those places are of interest to me, and I wonder how it extends into our lives. It will further extend into our lives where that's where I wanted to get to. And the only way you can get to that, I think, without being sort of didactic, is to be didactic with satire. And it was fun. That's the other thing. I needed something that was truly fun, that I couldn't wait to get to the drawing board to draw Nixon, you know. I mean, who wouldn't if you're a cartoonist, right? So I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. To me, it was actually a very important book on many, many levels.
Yeah, and I am starting to understand that you kind of have to have like not exactly a side project, but a second thing going on that's not the big heavy book.
Yeah, the big heavy stuff has brought me down over time. So I need something else, even if it's heavy in its own way. It has some element of humor in it.
Are you willing to talk about the thing you're working on Saturdays now, or do you?
Oh,
want to keep
my
that
Rolling
a secret?
Stones book, of course. The whole idea is to keep talking about that book so it'll become mythological, and people will actually buy it when it comes out.
I'm on board. This is an old Stones strip, not something that's in the
No,
new
it's
thing
not
you're
in it.
talking about.
Right.
But since you were going to maybe say, do you want to say a little more about what the Rolling Stones book is, or?
It's just everything I've been thinking, and yeah, basically. I mean, it's
Okay.
like, it's everything that isn't journalism, that isn't bump. I don't know. I hope it's really fun. It's really fun for me to draw. So hopefully people will enjoy it. But of course, bump was really fun for me to draw, and people maybe didn't get it.
Just because people didn't buy it doesn't mean people didn't enjoy it. I mean, the people who bought it, I liked it. I think it's.
Thanks.
I think it's a. I want to see more of it.
Well,
You know,
I mean,
I think it's a really. I wish there were more, really. Visceral satire like that. And I feel the need for it even more now than I did a couple of years ago.
Right.
But, I mean, I want something that is unrelentingly holding government to the flame or whatever, and saying, you know, no, this is wrong.
right,
And look at what it looks like.
right.
You know, you get in the same way that with comics, you get an unlimited capacity to do reenactments or whatever. You can, you know, you can put the 500 guys on a horse into in the same way you can take your fictional president to a faraway planet, and it doesn't cost any more.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not.
That's a good way of putting it.
It's you know, it's still visible. It's still there. So you know, you can. I don't know. I like the kind of extremity of the argument of bump.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I think the Stones thing is, I'm really trying to experiment too with the form. And in my journalism work, I mean, perhaps there are formal elements to it, but you can't run wild, and sometimes you want to. I mean, the thing about my journalism work is I've tried to sort of make form really fit what the journalism needs. But there's just that part of you as a cartoonist that just wants to just gallop. And this is, you know, for better or for worse, I'm allowing myself in the Stones project to do that.
This is old work also, but from
Right.
a pre-journalism autobiographical strip called "In the Company of Long Hair" that was about being on tour with the band The Miracle Workers.
The Miracle Workers in Europe. Yeah.
And on the left, you see them pictured as stallions. On the right, it's a sort of post-gig party hangout on the steps of the Roman Forum or something
Yeah.
like that.
Pantheon or something.
Yeah, and there's just a couple of, you know, overly stylized, slightly more freewheeling rock and roll-ish things, you know.
It was a fun book to do. I mean, it was somewhat overcooked. If I had to do it again, I'd be a little more restrained. I think it would have helped it, but it was actually a lot of fun to draw.
Yeah, well, the unrestrained seems appropriate though for the subject matter, right? I mean, those guys are not. It's not a restrained atmosphere.
No, not at all. It was fun. Let's say that.
You can, if you're interested in that, you can find it in a collection that's called "But I Like It." That's I think that's the version of it that's in print right now, right?
Right.
Yeah. I think that we have a little bit of time to take a handful of questions from you guys in the audience, and I also think that probably the acoustics in here are okay, that we may not need a mic. If you just put a hand up and let me call on you. Do you have a...
But first, I just want to say that there's a reception after this in the Hale Gallery, which looks like it could be pronounced either Hole or Hell, but it's the Hale Gallery.
And is that going to be easy to see when you walk out?
I think somebody will be there, possibly me, to help point people there.
Okay. Oh, because of the recording, we do want the mics for recording purposes. Do you want to run them out? Okay. I think James has a question.
So you find yourself in these places when you don't know who you're looking for when you go in exactly. You're meeting strangers. Has anyone ever, like, outright tried to? You felt like maybe they were scamming you, or perhaps telling you stories that weren't true?
You know, during Footnotes in Gaza, during the research for that book, my colleague, the guy who was helping me, who was from the community, who was helping me with the translation. He was pretty much, we were living together and he was my guide for 2 months. He gave up 2 months of his life to work with me. He was a real good barometer of that stuff. Every now and then he'd lean into me and say, I think this guy is lying. And it would be about something that would have been a great story for the book. I'd be going, wow, really? And he'd be, nah, the story doesn't ring. It didn't ring true with him sometimes. Sometimes things didn't ring true with me. And we would sort of compare notes and decide what we would or wouldn't use. If you heard enough of those stories, you knew what really kind of happened on some level. So there was that. As far as, I won't say scams, but when you're in a situation where people are really desperate, a lot of people look at you as perhaps a way out or some form of salvation. And those are always really difficult human interactions to negotiate.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks, James.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonah. Get them.
Thank you. As was said during your conversation and a lot of your work, you're the main character a lot of the times. You're the one we're following around most of the time. And out of curiosity, what do you think is the role of the author or the journalist in the journalism, especially in the way you tell it?
Well, I think that's changed over time. If you saw my Palestine book, in a lot of ways, I'm the only thing connecting all these episodes together. That's why I call it episodic. It's not like there's a great story arc. It's more like here are pieces of the occupation, and the only person who is going to be the thread is my character. So I think I'm more to the forefront there. In a book like Gorazda, the one about the Bosnian War, there were people like Ricky, the guy who was singing those songs, people like Eden. There were a few young women, teenagers, who were really sort of vivacious and interesting.
They appear in chapters called Silly Girls Part 1 and Silly Girls Part 2.
Right.
Yeah. And
all these people were interesting enough that they could really carry the story more than me. So my character then was more, I was more able to use my character just to bring certain things into relief. So it wasn't that important for me to be a character, but at certain points, when I realized people were using me as a mailman, basically, to get messages to loved ones they hadn't seen in 3.5 years. When they knew I was going back and forth between Gorazda and Sarajevo, the people I was meeting in Gorazda were under siege, still technically, and could not leave their enclave. I could. So suddenly I was, taking notes back and forth between husband and wife. People giving me money, can you buy me jeans in Sarajevo, that kind of thing. And that brings something about their story into relief. And so it's useful to use myself as a character. It's hard to write yourself out of that. So over time, it's been less necessary to make myself into a character. I mean, and that Palestine is maybe charming in a certain way, but it is what it is. And now I try to, as much as possible, people are driving the story. Other people are driving the stories.
To build off the first question, was there ever a time that you sacrificed the truth for the story? Like you knew it was wrong, but you were like, "That's really, really cool," and you put it in anyway?
Ooh. Boy, I would hope not. Not knowingly. I've made mistakes. In Gorazda, there was a doctor who was kind of the head of the hospital, and he was telling me about some of the patients they had during the siege. Many people were wounded during the war, and very badly wounded, and the hospital was really working at this pace. And I sat down with him, and he was considered kind of the guy you talk to when you want to hear what happened medically in Gorazda. After the war, when I came back to Gorazda and I was giving my book out, people were saying, that guy was so corrupt during the war. There was a lot of trade. I mean, war is business. So people were trading, even though they were an enclave surrounded, there were people who were trading, and money could be made from what you could withhold or what you owned, right? So he was involved in a certain amount of corruption, but at the time, no one was willing to tell me that because they didn't know if the peace agreement was actually going to be signed. You never really knew what was going to happen from one week to another. So people were very careful what they told me. They told me later. So I drew him, he was telling stories of operations, and I really unwisely drew him performing the operations. And he might have been performing these operations, but I felt sort of bad about that. So what I did is, for the second edition of the book, I redrew those panels just to show a doctor working, but you don't identify the doctor. I think the stories he was telling me about the operations are true, but the fact that, in my eyes, he wasn't some like heroic figure anymore, I had to, for my own sake, had to take him out of that, and for the sake of the people who knew him, had to take him out of that.
I wanted to ask you about your collaboration with Chris Hedges.
Okay.
And in that book, it seems like, well, he does the journalistic parts where he tries to tell sort of the big story and look at larger factors of economic analysis. And you really focus on telling individual people's stories. And I wanted to ask, how did that collaboration come up, and how did that method of trying to tell the stories of these areas come about?
Chris and I met in Bosnia. In fact, we met in a armored jeep going to Gorazda, and I was actually furious because he was working for the New York Times at the time, and you had to be at the convoy at 5 o'clock in order to. At 5 o'clock they were going to leave, and it was very hard to get a place on the convoy, and they often weren't taking journalists, and I got a place on the convoy, and then we were waiting, and I was thinking, why are we waiting? And someone said, well, there's a New York Times correspondent who's coming, and we're waiting for him. And I thought, well, they would have left without me, I tell you that. So I was kind of pissed off at this guy, but then we just started talking about books, and we became really good friends. And at some point, I was best man at one of his weddings, and we collaborated, actually. We did a story for Harper's in Gaza, which became kind of the genesis, really, of Footnotes in Gaza for me. He was giving a talk in Portland, where I was living, and afterwards we were having a drink, and we were just talking about the state of America. And over a drink, we said, let's just do a book. Let's go to places and figure this out. And then, he came up with a lot of the structure for it. Let's go to 4 places that in some ways represent 4 groups of people: white people, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, or Hispanics. And let's see how the economy has run over all of these groups of people. And so we chose places that were geographically disparate, but also could tell stories of different groups. We did the interviews together, but he took the lead on the interviews and probably did 80–90% of the questions. And at the end, he would say, do you have any questions? And I might clean up a few things here and there. But to me, it was really instructive, how I really admire his interview techniques. To me, it was okay, let me learn something from Chris. And I learned some things from him. I remember we were in Camden, and you're approaching someone who is having a lot of problems with their children in a really violent situation. And I wasn't sure how I would have approached this person. And he said, as a mother, how do you feel about what's going on here? And you realize he'd given her something so that she didn't have to be stammering around. It gave her something that she could hang her thoughts on, and then go from there. But it was just sort of an interesting way of easing into it and personalizing it in that way. So for me, it was a good experience, and I've always enjoyed spending time with Chris. He's one of the most well-read people I know, and brilliant, and we have good conversations.
I think there was a question way down in front, Jonah.
I'm just curious, has it ever happened to you that someone read your work and found that it didn't do their experience justice if they were in this, or that it didn't accurately reflect what happened to them, and how did you respond to that?
You know, I'd say fortunately I haven't had that happen. I haven't had anyone tell me it didn't reflect their experience. To me, what's important is that someone kind of recognizes themselves, I don't mean as a drawn figure, but as a human person being depicted. Nevin, the fixer, he and I are still in touch. And he actually got, well, this is interesting, he got asylum in France because he'd been, as a Bosnian Serb living in Sarajevo, he'd been kicked out of his apartment by Muslim refugees, like someone who was like a, you know, I won't say a warlord, but someone who was like looking after some Muslim refugees and just kicked out this random Serb. So he used, I mentioned that in the book about him, and he used that in France when he was trying to get asylum. He actually showed that particular passage to the authorities, which is interesting because if they'd actually read the book, they would see that he claims that he was gun smuggling in Marseille before the war, which probably would have been a demerit. But actually, you know, and I remember him saying, I was really worried, like, what's Nevin going to think? And Nevin told me afterwards, did I really try to squeeze that much money out of you? Because there are many instances in the book where he's doing that. But he took it in stride, you know. So I can't say that anyone's really come down on me about that in that way. And you know, those things make me nervous.
I'm just here, yeah.
Oh,
my question was very similar around how much did you create the way you were portraying people with them, going back and having conversations, or did you just collect all the material, come back to where you live and put it together? And it sounds like you just kind of hoped for the best of the way you were portraying people. And just how much do you see it as a partnership with them in the final product that you're making?
I'm a journalist who doesn't think in terms of partnership. I think in terms of getting the story, and you have to be careful of the word partnership. But I did see people who I was working with, people like Eden, who began to be invested in what I was doing, and definitely someone like Abed in Footnotes in Gaza. It became his project too. He became just as involved in putting it together and getting to the heart of the story as I did. So there was collaboration in that sense, where I was bouncing ideas off him. He was helping me determine if he thought something was truthful or not. So that to me is a partnership, and I'm saying that as someone who is careful of the word partnership, because it's hard when you're negotiating. I never want to be sort of told what to do, or I don't like the idea of people looking over my shoulder when I'm doing my work. Now I'm doing something for about Indigenous people in Canada, and that becomes something else, because cosmologically, very traditional people can think differently, and I have to negotiate something else I haven't really done before, which is if you're going to draw certain things, it really seems incumbent to get it truly right, especially if I'm not really used to them. And if you're drawing something that's mythological, I'm more than willing to send my images to say, does this, first of all, to test the fact that what they think of someone like me drawing that sort of stuff, and then if they're okay with that, does the way I portrayed it look okay to them? And you know, they wrote back and said, it's good, it looks good. So that made me feel pretty good. But you can say it's a partnership only in the sense that if someone says that something's off the record, I take that. I mean, that's off the record. And sometimes I normally don't let people, I don't show someone what I've done so they can decide afterwards. Though I did do that with an indigenous traditional person because I wasn't quite sure if he understood what I was going to be doing with the material. I tried to make it clear. I came back to him the day after having a very interesting conversation and said, this is what you told me. Can you sort of verify that? And do you mind, there was some very sensitive stuff about animism. Can I write about that? And he said, oh no, please don't. And of course I'm not, I gave him the chance to veto it afterwards, which I normally wouldn't do, but I feel like this is culturally, this is a different kind of setup. So yeah, I'm sorry it's lost because it was great, it was amazing stuff, but that's the breaks.
It just occurred to me, and this is just a yes or no question really, but do you ever change people's faces in order to, I mean, I know there are people who speak to you on the condition of anonymity. Do you draw them differently if they're being anonymous?
It depends. It depends what they want. If they want to be anonymous and they don't want me to take their picture or something like that, and they don't want to be identified, yeah, I have to respect that. But some people, surprisingly, who seemed like this person can really get in trouble, they say, nah, go ahead. I'm fine with it. So it's always a surprise in a way.
But mostly the characters, we would, although they pass through a sort of cartooning filter, we might recognize them if we saw them.
In Footnotes in Gaza, I mean, that's probably where things were really, people had to be careful what they said. Well, it's funny because they're talking about something that happened almost 50 years ago at that point. And some people were still afraid of retribution for saying what they said. And I just respected those individuals who said, I don't want my picture taken, no, I don't want to be depicted, but I will tell you this stuff. What I would do then is just on the margin, I would draw something about them that would make me feel I wasn't making up something out of whole cloth. Whether it had to do with, oh, they have a beard, oh, they're wearing a keffiyeh, nothing that would identify them, but make me feel, okay, there's something here that
still
I'm not
represents
just,
the person.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we could do one more, if or is the mic with somebody already?
I've got the mic right here.
Hey, Glynis.
Hi.
Hi, Glynis.
Your own story seems very interesting. Being born in Malta and living in Australia, and then Portland and Berlin, and traveling. Do you ever anticipate writing about yourself in this way?
I think the Stones book is going to have a lot of stuff in there. It's not going to be an autobiography, really, but just selective autobiography, but it's not just autobiography. But I'm going to work a lot of things into it. Yeah.
Can I ask another question? Sure. Why are your panels tilted like that? The word, the
tilted?
Text. Yeah.
Oh, she means the captions.
Yeah,
I mean, there are moments where the panels get tilted too.
Yeah, the panels too, but.
Like he'll tilt a panel like this.
I know
this is way more tilted.
Well,
but that's because that's an action scene.
I was very influenced by Ferdinand Céline, the writer, and he has this thing in his books where he will have these phrases that are really punchy and separated by ellipses, and often he's being really redundant, but it's just really powerful. And I kept thinking, how am I going to get that? How am I going to get that power in captions? And I realized you could sort of cut captions up, so you could actually have these little pithy phrases, but to line them up never seemed quite right. And if the whole idea was to give you a sense of movement and excitement or whatever it is, tilting them just gave them this sort of tension, this nervousness. And that's probably the main reason.
I just wanted to hear you say it.
We'll do.
We're getting close to the time when we should wrap.
I think.
I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we have a reception following this event, and we'll have the opportunity to kind of informally continue the conversation.
Yeah. Were you holding on for a question, Joy, or? Okay. Well, maybe we should wrap then, and then further informal discussion during the reception. Folks, thanks for coming out and for sticking around and for listening to Joe.
Thank you. Thank you.